If I am not running a meeting, do I even exist? This is the heart-wrenching question Ellie Spencer asked when her lifelong title suddenly vanished and the silence became deafening. If you miss the wisdom hidden in this story, you might spend your retirement trapped in a noisy cycle of busyness, never realizing that your quiet years are actually a graduation into the most profound abundance. We spend 40 years wishing for a minute of peace, and then we retire, and suddenly the peace is so loud that it makes us anxious, driving us to hover over our adult children like well-meaning GPS systems. We feel compelled to be doing something because we fear the frightening silence of our own hearts, a struggle that Ellie and so many of us, especially those who have spent decades in the classroom, understand all too well. On the third day of being confined to her bedroom, Ellie felt the walls start to close in. For a woman who had spent 35 years navigating the bustling hallways of an elementary school, the silence wasn't just quiet, it was heavy. It felt like a physical weight pressing against her chest. As a retired principal, her identity had always been tied to the noise, the ringing of the morning bell, the rhythmic squeak of sneakers on waxed linoleum, and the constant stream of teachers and parents seeking her expert counsel. In those halls, she was a sun around which 300 planets orbited. But here, in the dim light of her sickbed, the sun had gone out. She stared at the ceiling, tracing the faint cracks in the plaster, and a terrifying thought took root: I am disappearing. If she wasn't managing a crisis, if she wasn't correcting a behavioral issue, if she wasn't the one with all the answers, did she even exist? It's a question many of us face when the title on our business card is replaced by a blank space. We realize our self was actually just a collection of tasks. Desperate to drown out the ringing in her ears, not the physical kind, but the metaphorical kind that comes from a life suddenly gone still, she reached for Henri Nouwen's Out of Solitude. She opened the book to a page that felt like a slap in the face. Solitude is the furnace of transformation. Without solitude, we remain victims of our society and continue to be entangled in our illusions. Illusions? Ellie grumbled to her lukewarm bowl of chicken soup. I don't have illusions, Henri. I have a color-coded calendar and a Fitbit that tells me exactly how many steps I've taken toward my goals. She felt a surge of indignation. How could a man who lived in a monastery understand the pressure of being the most productive senior in Connecticut? But as the fever flickered, so did her defenses. Nouwen gently argued that what we call loneliness is actually the painful feeling of being alone and unwanted, a void we try to fill with noise, news cycles, and endless errands. However, solitude is the glory of being alone with the one who loves you most. It is the move from a fearful place to a loving place. Ellie decided to try a radical experiment. She reached over and clicked off the 24-hour news cycle. The shouting heads on the screen vanished into a black void. She sat by the window and looked out at her garden. At first, it was agonizing. Her principal's brain started listing all the deficiencies: the weeds in the hostas, the peeling paint on the birdhouse, the overgrown hedges. But then, she forced herself to just breathe. After 10 minutes, the frantic list-making slowed down. She noticed a single cardinal perched on a winterbear branch. She felt the warmth of the late afternoon sun on her wrinkled hands. And then, it happened. A quiet voice from within whispered, I'm still Ellie. Even without the office. Even without the authority. I am still here, and I am enough. That was the precise moment her loneliness began to transform into the sacred space of solitude. Ellie had always prided herself on being the ultimate fixer. In her world, problems weren't obstacles, they were data points waiting for a 3-point plan. If her daughter faced a career hurdle, Ellie would spend the night drafting a resume and a strategy guide. If the local church faced a budget deficit, Ellie was the first one through the door with a clipboard and a blueprint for a high-yield bake sale. She called this caring, and she wore it like a badge of honor. But Nouwen's words in the second chapter stung her more than the flu ever could. He wrote, "We are so busy caring that we forget to pray. We think the world depends on our efforts, rather than on God's grace." Ouch, Henri, Ellie muttered, pulling the duvet tighter. It was a direct hit. She realized that her caring was often just a sophisticated way of trying to maintain control. Nguyen reminded her that Jesus, even at the height of his ministry when the crowds were literally tearing at his clothes for healing, would constantly withdraw to a lonely place. He didn't do this to escape his responsibilities, he did it to reconnect with his source. He knew that you cannot give what you do not have. Prayer, Nguyen taught, is not a way to change God's mind, but a way to change our own hearts until they beat in rhythm with His. Ellie looked down at her smartphone. There were 3 unreturned texts from her son, Mark. He was struggling with a stressful new corporate merger and felt completely overwhelmed. In the old Ellie days, she would have spent the next hour Googling stress management for executives and how to negotiate with difficult bosses so she could tell him exactly what to do. Instead, she did something that felt almost unnatural. She turned the phone face down. She closed her eyes. She spent the next 10 minutes just holding Mark in her heart. She didn't ask God for a specific outcome. She didn't try to dictate a solution. She simply sat in the silence, breathing in love and breathing out her son's name. She realized that her constant worrying was actually a very noisy, very ineffective form of caring. It produced heat but no light. But this quiet praying, this intentional act of letting go, was a powerful form of loving. As she sat there, she felt a physical weight lift off her shoulders. The tension in her neck, which she'd carried for years, suddenly eased. It turns out, she later joked to a friend, that the universe can actually run for a few hours without my expert management. Who knew? By stepping back, she hadn't stopped caring, she had finally started trusting. As we navigate our golden years, we often find ourselves locked in a peculiar tug-of-war with time. We feel the clock ticking faster, and in response, we grip the steering wheel of our lives, and the lives of everyone we love, with white-knuckled intensity. We live in a perpetual state of expectation. We expect the doctor to call with good news, we expect the weather to cooperate for the family reunion, and most of all, we expect our children and grandchildren to follow the proper roadmap we've laid out for them. For Ellie Spencer, this expectation trap was most evident in her relationship with her grandson, Leo. Ellie was a woman of structure. Having managed a school and thousands of students over 3 decades, she believed that life was a series of checkboxes. You study hard, you graduate, you find a stable career, and you contribute to society. Simple, right? But then there was Leo. Leo was currently taking what he called a gap year, which Ellie translated in her mind as sleeping until noon and wasting his potential on video games. Every time she saw him, her brain would automatically generate a 3-point plan for his immediate improvement. She expected him to be applying for law school. She expected him to show the same hustle she had during her 35 years in the trenches of education. When he didn't meet these expectations, Ellie didn't just feel disappointed, she felt a bitter, gnawing frustration. She felt like a failure as a matriarch. Stuck in her sickbed, Ellie turned to Nguyen. He wrote something that stopped her cold. Expectation is tied to a specific result. Hope is tied to a person, to the faithfulness of God. Ellie realized that her expectations were actually a form of spiritual cage. She was demanding that Leo provide her with a specific result, a law degree, so that she could feel successful. It wasn't about Leo's happiness, it was about her need for control. Nguyen argued that expectation is a grasping emotion, it demands a payout. But hope? Hope is an open-handed emotion. It allows us to say, I don't know the outcome, but I trust the journey. Nguyen's advice was radical, hope allows us to let go of the steering wheel. Ellie began to practice this releasing in the quiet of her room. She visualized herself physically letting go of a steering wheel. She told herself, I hope for Leo. I hope that he discovers his purpose. I hope he knows he is loved, regardless of his GPA. The shift was transformative. A few weeks later, at Sunday dinner, the old tension was gone. Instead of grilling Leo with questions about his career path, Ellie simply listened. She watched him laugh. She saw a kind, thoughtful young man instead of a project that needed finishing. Suddenly, she wasn't the disappointed grandma anymore, she was the hopeful matriarch. By trading her rigid expectations for a fluid, trusting hope, she didn't just free Leo, she freed herself from the burden of managing his future. One of the hardest habits for a retired professional to break is the fixer instinct. For 35 years, Ellie was the woman who had the answer for everything. If a parent was upset, she had a policy to quote. If a teacher was struggling, she had a workshop to recommend. She was a woman of action, and she carried this fixer energy straight into her retirement. Her friends called her the casserole commando. If someone was going through a hard time, Ellie would show up at their front door with a hot meal in one hand and a list of 5 reasons why you should look on the bright side in the other. She meant well, of course. But in her heart, Ellie was uncomfortable with other people's pain. She wanted to fix their sadness because their sadness made her feel helpless. And Ellie Spencer did not like feeling helpless. Nguyen challenged this casserole commando philosophy with a startling truth: the greatest gift we can give to the suffering is not a solution, but our presence. To stay in the lonely place with them without trying to change it. He explained that compassion is born in solitude. Only when we have faced our own emptiness, as Ellie had to do during her week of forced stillness, can we stand to be around the emptiness of others. If we haven't made peace with our own silence, we will always try to fill other people's silence with noise and solutions. A few days after she recovered from the flu, Ellie went to visit her neighbor, Betty. Betty's husband had recently been moved into a memory care facility, and Betty was drowning in a sea of grief and what-ifs. The old Ellie would have walked in, opened the curtains, and started listing all the reasons why Betty should be grateful. At least he's safe, Betty. At least you have a good pension. She would have tried to talk Betty out of her pain. But the new Ellie, the one who had spent hours staring at the ceiling and learning the language of solitude, did something different. She walked in and just sat down on the porch next to Betty. She didn't offer a 3-point plan. She didn't give a motivational speech. She simply reached over and took Betty's hand. They sat there for nearly 40 minutes. They watched the hummingbirds dart around the hibiscus. They listened to the distant sound of a lawnmower. It was a silence that would have terrified Ellie just a month prior. But now, it felt sacred. By not trying to fix Betty's grief, Ellie was actually honoring it. She was giving Betty the space to feel exactly what she needed to feel. As Ellie was leaving, Betty looked at her with tears in her eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Ellie. Everyone else keeps trying to tell me it's okay. You're the only one who just stayed." Ellie realized that her fixing had actually been a barrier to true connection. Compassion isn't about having the right answer, it's about having the right presence. In her 35 years of teaching, she had given thousands of answers. But in that 1 hour on the porch with Betty, she had given something much more valuable, a piece of her own quiet heart. As the lingering shadows of the flu finally began to retreat, Ellie stepped out of her bedroom for the first time in a week. She felt a bit like a ghost haunting her own hallways. She walked through the kitchen, the living room, and finally out onto the patio. She expected to find a world in disarray, a house that had surely missed its architect. But as she looked around, she noticed something that was both a relief and a profound shock: the world hadn't ended. In fact, the world was doing quite well without her. Her garden was a bit shaggy around the edges, yes, but the flowers were still reaching for the sun. Her email inbox was a digital mountain of unread messages, but the sky hadn't fallen because she hadn't hit reply. Even the charity committee, which she was certain would crumble without her expert supervision, had apparently managed to hold a successful meeting and even vote on a new project. For a woman who had spent 35 years as the captain of her ship, grading tens of thousands of papers, managing hundreds of students, and being the woman who gets things done, this realization initially felt like a sharp sting of irrelevance. If she wasn't needed, did she still matter? She sat on her patio with a lukewarm cup of chamomile tea, feeling the weight of her own uselessness. But then, she opened Nguyen's book to the final, crowning chapter. We spend our entire lives trying to hold on to our influence, our health, our schedules, and our image. But the soul only finds its true rest when it finally learns to let go. Ellie looked at her reflection in the glass of the sliding door. She saw the silver in her hair, the fine lines around her eyes, and the hands that had worked so tirelessly for decades. You know, Henri, she whispered to the empty air, I spent 40 years being Mrs. Spencer, the principal. I spent the last 10 years being the productive senior. But who is just Ellie? Nouwen's answer, echoing through the pages, was breathtakingly simple, you are the one who is loved before you do anything at all. That afternoon, Ellie did something that her former self would have considered mad. She looked at her calendar and saw a 2 p.m. Zoom meeting about the community garden fence. Instead of clicking the link, she sent a brief, polite apology and closed her laptop. She went to the attic and pulled out a dusty box of watercolors she hadn't touched since the mid-90s. She didn't try to paint a masterpiece for an exhibition. She didn't try to be productive. She simply sat at her kitchen table and let the blue paint bleed into the yellow on the thick, textured paper. She watched the colors dance and mingle. For the first time in her 77 years, she wasn't achieving anything. She wasn't meeting a goal. She was just being. Nouwen warns us, our productivity is often a way to hide from the fact that we are naked before God. Ellie laughed as she accidentally got a smudge of cerulean blue on the tip of her nose. She realized that her golden years weren't a decline or a loss of status, they were a graduation. She had finally graduated from the school of doing and was now a freshman in the University of Being. She was no longer a human doing. She had finally, at long last, become a human being. My dear friends, here at Lingering Light, Ellie's journey through the pages of Henri Nouwen taught her that solitude is not a place of lack, but a place of incredible abundance. She still has her Fitbit, and yes, she still spends many hours in her garden. But the spirit behind her actions has changed. She no longer works to prove her worth, she works because she is already worthy. She has made a permanent change to her life. She now ensures there are blank spaces in her calendar every single day. She calls them her Henri minutes. These are times when she purposefully does nothing. She doesn't fix, she doesn't plan, and she doesn't worry. She simply sits and remembers that she is the beloved. Maybe you've been feeling a little disappeared lately. Perhaps the house feels too quiet now that the kids are gone and your career has come to an end. You might feel like your most useful years are behind you, and you're just waiting for the clock to run out. If that resonates with you, I want you to listen closely to Henri Nouwen's gentle whisper, you are not what you do. You are not what you have. You are the beloved. The quiet you are experiencing right now isn't a hole you are falling into, it is a garden where you are being nurtured. It is the place where you finally get to meet the person you were always meant to be, the person who exists apart from your job title, your bank account, or your list of accomplishments. I want to ask you tonight, is there a Henri minute you can take tomorrow? Can you carve out just 10 minutes of absolute silence? No television, no scrolling through your phone, no fixing anything in the house. Just you, your breath, and the sun on your face. If you try it, please come back to this video and tell us in the comments how it felt. Did it feel like loneliness at first? Did it start to shift into solitude? The world will always be noisy. It will always demand that you do more and be more. But your heart can be a place of perfect peace. You don't have to run anymore. You are already home. Thank you so much for joining me in this quiet corner tonight. If this story touched your heart, please show some love by hitting the like button and subscribing to our channel. It helps us keep the porch light on for others who are looking for their way home. Good night, dear friends. I look forward to seeing you in our next video. Remember, you are loved, exactly as you are.